All right, well, welcome everybody to this AASA webinar. I'm Chris Knapp. I'm a professor of architecture at Bond University, and I serve as the treasurer for the AASA. So hence my involvement in putting my hand up to help moderate today's webinar on online learning. So today we have 4 presenters, and I'm just going to introduce them quickly, talk a little bit about the kind of protocols that we'll follow to get through today's hour-long session, and then hand it over for our presenters. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Stephen Feast, who's an architect and online coordinator of Curtin University's architecture program that's delivered online through Open Universities, and leader of the digital learning portfolio within the AASA. Next, we have Jason Crow, who's a senior lecturer at Monash University and also a licensed architect in the United States. His research explores technological changes and how they impact material ontology and artisanal epistemology. We also have Mohammed Makki, who's a senior lecturer at UTS, where he's researching and teaching in advanced computational design. He's co-founder of the Grasshopper plugin Wallasey and co-founder of the architectural practice MSSM Associates. And then finally, we have Elizabeth Strauss, a sessional tutor teaching first year and second year architectural design classes at Curtin, where she also has online thesis students. Elizabeth is a registered architect in the US and Australia and has taught online architectural design since 2012. Okay, so today how we're going to run is basically to move through our program with about 10 minutes per presenter, presenting on different topics related to online learning. So during this time, we're going to have the chat function disabled, just so that we don't create any undue distractions. But please, if you have questions, please use the Q&A portal that should be at the bottom of your Zoom controls, and log questions. And what we'll do is we'll come back to answer those questions after the presentations have concluded. And so once we go through some of those written questions, we'll also take the opportunity to have some live questions. So if you want to ask a question live within the webinar, just raise your hand so that will give us an order to answer those questions by. And then we'll go through, I'll turn on people's microphones so you'll be enabled to speak into the webinar, and we can run things more like an engaged discussion. So hopefully Zoom lives up to its billing. I'll be honest in saying this is the first time I've moderated a Zoom webinar, so bear with us. The other thing to mention is that this webinar is being recorded, and we will lodge the recording on the AASA website, and we'll also send through a link to those of you who have registered for attending today. So I just wanted to also, before we turn over to presentations, point you back to where some resources currently exist. So the image that you're looking at now is a screenshot of the AASA website, so aasa.org.au. And in particular, if you go to the projects tab, which is over on the left-hand side, that will take you to our e-learning session that we ran in 2017, which had presentations from a number of academics from Australia and New Zealand. And so there's videos of all of those presentations, as well as a report that was prepared by Professor Glenn Hill from University of Sydney. And that's the same place where we'll also lodge the resources from today. And then also per an email that you would have received, at least those of you who are heads of school, you would have received this message just reminding you that anybody that is a member of AASA, and so by extension that means all academic staff at AASA member schools, are affiliate members of the ACSA, which is the North American equivalent. And they've been running a series of online learning sessions as well. So their pivot to online learning sessions, which are a number of webinars, and I think they have some more that are also going to be running this week. So they've been doing those for about the past fortnight. They usually happen to be our Saturday morning, which is a little bit inconvenient, but they also have those recorded and available online. So there's quite a range of topics that they've also been covering on the ACSA site. So just keep those in mind. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over. So I'm going to unshare my screen and over to our first presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
That's me. Thanks, Chris. So, hi everyone, just attempting to share my screen as well. How's that? So, my name is Stephen Feast. As Chris said, I work at Curtin in the online program. We've been running our architecture program fully online. Well, we run the campus course as well, but we've been running a fully online version of that since 2013. We received accreditation for the master in 2018. So one of the things I've been telling our students that are really unsure about this whole move to online is that they can be reassured that we know how to do online teaching in architecture. There's a fully online accredited program in Australia. So they shouldn't have to worry too hard about the effect that this move to online will have. But I wanted to try and make things meaningful and immediate and practical today. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are the things that we do in our tutor introduction or tutor induction, and starting with what students themselves need to be able to learn online, the three main teaching methods for online, a few tips and tricks. At the moment, it feels like a lot of people are just trying to stop the bleeding. So looking at what we can do beyond the immediate point as well. And then some further references and resources. So I've just got to figure out how to change my slide. Sorry. So first up, students' needs are different now that they're online, and we need to recognize that. Students will have a huge range of internet speeds, for example, and hardware that's suitable, and also the nous or just technological savvy, which we expect that digital natives will all have, but some of the time they're fine to run through apps on their phone and they spend all their lives on that. But once they're in front of a computer, they don't necessarily have a lot of problem solving skills. And so a lot of the time they can be almost as fearful as, as we might be in this stage. And so being there and being able to reassure them and work through some of the simple technological things is important. And so the next thing is teacher presence, being there, but even more importantly, being seen to be there for students. So we've had tutors in the past who we've asked to check their discussion boards every couple of days. That's part of what we do in the online program. And there was a time tutor hadn't posted any comments for a week or so, and I said, oh, what's going on here? It's been a week. And he said, oh yeah, I've been looking every couple of days, they're going fine. But for the students, that just appeared that they were being ignored for that whole time. So it's really important for them to be able to see that their teachers are around and are available. And it doesn't have to be available 24 hours a day, but if you set up some expectations at the beginning of a course of when you're going to be available, it's important to stick to them. And for students to be able to see that. Now, engaging content is the next thing. Just taking campus lectures or recordings of campus lectures and posting them online, that's not the best way to do online content. I'm not sure how many people will be here with other windows open and maybe checking their email and doing other things as well. But that's how we're going to need to engage with our students now. So we're going to have to find ways to really get them interested and paying attention for the time, you know, the important short amounts of time that we actually spend with them. And so for lectures, it's often more important in the online format to keep them into shorter chunks. I'll talk a bit more about breaking them up later. And having things, trying to make things more interactive. And then the last thing is social and informal connections, because students in our online course, one of the biggest obstacles to their success is just the isolation, that instead of having a classroom surrounded by their colleagues and friends that they're all working with together at the same time, they're just sitting alone at their computer. And that's bad enough for our students before they were stuck in their houses and can't get out. And now we're all stuck. So those social and informal connections are going to be even more important now, just for students' own resilience and mental health. So the three main teaching methods for online. First up, there's the provision of content, which are lectures or readings or whatever students do, or however you communicate the information to students. The next thing is synchronous sessions. So that's the language of online learning. The synchronous sessions are when you're there at the same time as the students. So at the moment, that is probably mostly web conferencing. It could also be live chat. But another important thing in online learning is the asynchronous feedback. And that's the feedback that students get when they're not in a session with you. And that can be periodic, but that's going to probably become more important now that everyone's on, or yeah, everyone is online. If you have studios where there's one session a week, you probably need to create some kind of format or platform for students to be able to get feedback a few more times during the week before that session, because things tend to happen more slowly online in the synchronous sessions. So you might not be able to get through everybody in the same way that you usually would. And being able to provide feedback outside of that time is really important for students. So in terms of provision of content, the most important thing is that that's targeted to this new mode. So lectures, if you can write lectures where you're talking about an assignment or briefs or dates or things that are changing, that kind of housekeeping information, if you can make sure that that's something that's separate and can be removed from the lecture and snipped out of it, then you can reuse the other parts of your lecture in the future. And if it's broken into subheadings where you can keep segments of it, 7 to 15 minutes, that's probably an ideal time to have somebody sit down and concentrate and stare at a screen, because staring at a screen is obviously a lot different to sitting in a class with someone, or to watching a lecture where you can rest your eyes. You've usually got something to look at a bit further away. At the end of the content, if there are self-directed activities or reflections or questions for students to work through to assist them with comprehension and retention, and the activities that they would normally do in class will need to be rewritten, obviously, to be self-directed, but it's important for there to be, again, a platform for them to share the outcomes of all of those things. Then in the synchronous session, so we're mostly doing web conferencing and architecture. As Chris did at the beginning of this session, it's important to set your etiquette and expectations at the beginning of a session so everyone knows how that's going to be done. People have different ideas of what's the best group size, but have a look at that. If you're just doing mostly one-on-one sessions with students, it doesn't make sense to have a whole class in the room at the same time. It doesn't make sense just to have that one student there either. You want to try and share as much as possible without wasting your own time or wasting all the other students' time. So try to engage everybody who's there. There's usually a chat box, and you can ask the students who are online to respond to certain things in the chat and share amongst themselves while you're doing that. One of the things that we sometimes do is ask students who are attendees who aren't necessarily part of the immediate critique to be the first ones to respond to the student who has, so at least there's one other student there who needs to be paying attention. So learn the tools of your platform is another one. So I think Mohammed's going to show some drawing, or Jason as well. So drawing over the top of work is very important in architecture. If you've got a mouse, it's not very easy to draw with a mouse, but there are ways of getting tablets into the sessions, and you can usually draw a lot more accurately over work. Mice are fine if you're just trying to show where things can go, but it's very hard to do an expressive drawing with a mouse. The next one is mind your language. Students can't see your body language, and it's much harder to read facial expressions or cues like that. And we've found that in our online course, students tend to take offense a lot more at things that might be throwaway comments and that students wouldn't think twice about probably on campus, or they just blow it off with their mates straight afterwards. But online students who only have that word from you, they're sitting in front of their computer, they'll go away and stew. And so it's really important to just be careful and think about that. And acerbic comments can really be taken on board by students. The other thing that we do in our course is try and make the web conferencing sessions a time for interaction and not a lecture. This is the time to flip your classrooms. So the lectures happen can happen separately. They can be pre-recorded and sent out. And then the time that you spend with students is full of interaction. Now, Beth later, I think, is going to talk about times when that's not the case, and that's fine too. But most of the time, this is what we try to do. And also our desk crits become a lot more formal when we're doing them online. Students need to prepare a presentation every week. On campus in studio, there might be the case where you sit down next to a student and say, what have you done since last week? And they'll show you some work. Online, they really need to prepare to explain their work and to curate it. And so what we find when we run our classes, we've done a few blended ones with our online and campus programs, is that the online students are actually better at doing those presentations a lot of the time because they're just practiced at it. They do it virtually every single week. Now, so the asynchronous feedback, when it happens online, is more things like discussion boards, Facebook pages or blogs. It's important to keep a public space like that. Don't ask your students to email you. No one wants to get thousands of emails and have to answer the same question all over and over again. Keep your communication as public as you can. Ask students to post their questions in that public area. If you do get questions via email and the answers apply to everybody, we suggest our tutors to post their answer in the discussion board or in the what we call ePinUp, and then reply to the student saying, thanks for your question, it's been answered on the discussion board, and get students into the habit of using that platform that's set up for that. So the next thing is setting up expectations of when you're going to be able to reply to students. So like I said, we ask our tutors to check in online every couple of days to make sure students don't have to go that far. But it might be that you say, if you've got a studio on a Monday or Tuesday, if you've got students, if you have any questions, send them by Thursday, and I'll have a session of answering them out in one FAQ document or one announcement or something on the Friday. We tend to get students posting up pages and pages of work to their tutors and saying, what do you think? And that can be really difficult to respond to it in this asynchronous format. So we want students to be precise in their requests. What are they asking for? What are the important things that they've done since last time? And that way we can be a lot more targeted in responses to them. And that can become a platform for those social and informal interactions where they might see something, find a link on Facebook or Arc Daily or wherever, YouTube, and post a link in the site, hopefully relevant to their assignment or what they're doing. And that can create a bit of a community. The ePinUp system that we use, it also comes as an app on smartphones. And so we're trying to get students to spend more time in there using it as a social format and not just for learning. So a few specific tips and tricks. Obviously, submission formats will need to change. That doesn't only mean moving everything to A3 landscape, but that is one of the easiest ways to go. An important thing to remember in this is also, it's not just how a student's going to produce and submit the work, but how are you going to market? Because you and your team are going to have to spend a lot of time going through, like staring at a screen for a long time, and you need to think about what's the best format for that. We've run teams of 3 doing debates against each other in live sessions that have then been recorded. So a lot of things can still work the same. And when we ask students to send videos of presentations, we found that it's good to ask them for a video, but not be specific about how they create it. There's lots of information out there about how to create videos, and we give them a simplest version would be, say, a PowerPoint where there's audio in each of the slides, and that's been created into a video. But we've also had students do amazing presentations, and they post it up to YouTube, and then they'll just submit the link, the YouTube link for us. So there's lots of different ways of doing presentations like that. If you can, try to have access to immediate support. If you know someone who knows that your systems, get their phone number and put it on speed dial and hope they don't block you. Because when you're in a session, there's nothing worse than not being able to get in. People can't get in, something's not working. And a lot of the time with things like Zoom, or I know our Collaborate, Collaborate doesn't work right in Internet Explorer, and it works fine in Chrome. And that's one of the biggest problems that we get. Someone's clicked on a link and it's opened up in Internet Explorer. So if you've got access to someone who can answer your questions in the immediate term. You won't have to cancel, postpone sessions, that kind of thing. Short how-to videos are a great way to show students how to navigate the system. So it takes maybe 5 minutes to create a 1 minute clicking around the a website or your learning management system or the Zoom controls, that kind of thing. And the links to the YouTube videos can be posted or sent out to students, and they'll much rather watch a video than read 4 lines of instructions. And we've learned that through hard experience. Next one is, if you can, use a device or tablet for accurate drawing, and keep essential communications to a single channel. So things that you could just call out to a studio. If you're doing a one-on-one session in a web conference with a student, even though it's being recorded, you might want to say, oh, well, this actually applies to everybody. You should all understand this about the assignment, but not everyone is going to watch every second of a web conferencing session. So for those important things, when someone's asked for clarification about a particular assignment, it's better to try and have a single channel for those kinds of things, those important pieces of information. Last one here, I said, consider students as partners in this experiment. I think they should understand that we're all trying to work through this as well. I'm moving on because I'm running out a bit of time. So going over some of the previous things I've sent, but the ones I thought were more important. Cut all your lectures into shorter components, maintain a regular online presence, be careful with your language, and try and keep all the communication as public as you can. And so this one, once we get over this initial hurdle of figuring out what the hell we're doing, recorded lectures, if you can, put them into segments where the content is separate from some of the other information that's just relevant to this particular study period. You can build up a professional library of lectures that can then be used in future study periods that you won't have to repeat. If we all now document and record what we're doing, this is a massive opportunity for research and for learning, and we can spend time taking note of what new techniques we learn from this that can then go back and improve the campus experience for students. And we found that a lot of the time in our course, where tutors and coordinators will try something online, may or may not work, but then that can inform what we're doing on campus. So references and resources from this, Chris has already shown you the AA website. The ADSET website is also really good for online learning. It does say disability, but it's more about making online learning accessible and engaging, and looking at resilience of students. And a couple of the particular references that I use there, Kathy Stone and Vikleta Shusti. I'm sorry, I've gone a bit over time. Thanks, Chris. That's me done. A lot over time.
Okay, great. No worries, Stephen. I actually will use my stopwatch for the next one just so that we can move it along, though. So over to you, Jason, I believe is next. And I can see, I'll just note too, I can see at least one person has posted a question. So do start to pose questions if you have them. And we'll also launch a poll a little bit later to also get some feedback from people.
Okay, just checking to make sure everybody can see my screen. Yeah, so thanks, Steve and Chris, both for helping to organize this. So I have a somewhat different perspective than Steve, but I think actually it's kind of interesting to kind of think about the overlaps between some of my thinking and some of his recommendations. Just a little bit more background within this context. I'm a senior lecturer in Monash, and one of my responsibilities is coordinating our second year studios. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about is how I've worked towards developing a conceptual framework to smooth the transition for both my tutors and my students into a virtual architectural studio environment. Things that when I started thinking about how to make this happen and what might be productive in terms of making things simple, was to kind of focus on what we already know and to limit the amount of change that gets introduced relative to shifting from a physical place for studio and a virtual place for studio. Kind of a desire to avoid technological difficulties, because we knew that bandwidth was going to be an issue relative to the transition. And then finally, in terms of kind of assisting the tutors in particular, was to find ways to avoid forcing them to reconceptualize their studio outlines because they were already in place. So I'm going to start a little bit abstractly and kind of look at a couple of different tools that we're both familiar with. Obviously, there's a difference, and Steve has already kind of brought this up. There's a difference between the mouse and the pencil in terms of how we draw with them. And we can kind of approach the idea of shifting online as highlighting those differences, but in terms of triaging going online for a series of 8 different secondary studios, what I wanted to do was to avoid highlighting the differences and to focus on the similarities so that there could be some continuity between what we had planned on doing and what we ended up doing over the past week and a half. And so the big thing within this context, even though the pencil and the mouse are different, and there's some significant differences when you're working with a computational tool than with an analog tool, there is a gestural overlap. There is still an embodied movement that is at play, and we can kind of work on those analogs to begin to think differently about what it means to engage those things and to start to eliminate that difference. But then the question that comes up is, well, okay, so relative to a pencil and a mouse, we could substitute a stylus, for example, for the mouse, and we might get something closer to the experience, but there is a more radical difference between working online and working at your table. So the bigger question within the context of transitioning to studio in our case was kind of how do we make these two spaces, the space of the traditional drafting table, align with virtual places. And a lot of what this, and this picks up on what Stephen was already mentioning, a lot of what happens around the drafting table is intuitive, and it builds off of social dynamics and social cues that are second nature to us. So we tend to forget those kinds of behaviors that surround what we're doing, both as we're teaching and as we're learning. Within the virtual environment, those dynamics and cues tend to disappear. Or maybe the better way is to begin to think about understanding that they present themselves, or they offer an opportunity to present themselves differently. So we need to kind of focus on how we might emphasize how those social cues and dynamics reinforce the learning environment that we're creating when we go online for studio. So I'm going to use a little bit of an example of something that I've done some research on before, which is the effect of mediation on how we conceptualize our cities. And the image that's on screen right now is of a spontaneous snowball fight that happened in late winter of 2009 in New York City. So this is not interesting in of itself as a snowball fight, or even as an image of Times Square. What's more interesting is the manner in which, in combination with social media, a certain kind of dynamic began to play out, in which the space of Times Square shifted somewhere else and became another city. And the way that happened was that the image, the larger image, is by a photographer and blogger who had posted it on social media as he was walking across the square via his phone, and later did kind of develop those images further. But that also got picked up on Facebook relatively quickly, and there was a commenting system, and people were actually kind of having the snowball fight, and from various places around the world commenting on the snowball fight, as people were also commenting from within the snowball fight itself. So there's a kind of interconnected set of reactions that were happening relative to the mediation of Times Square that was displacing Times Square from the snowball fight into the virtual media or into social media, but at the same time engaging that place in a very particular kind of way. One of the things that kind of happened as a result was people began to kind of reimagine what the city was relative to this kind of transformation that was occurring through the media that was engaging with it. So, you know, the comment here by Cynthia was that New York became something else, and that it reminded her of Bruegel's painting. Now, what's interesting to me about this as a kind of a mediated environment is that there's a combination of very particular kinds of communication that are both synchronous and asynchronous with a virtualized or mediated place that has some reality and some unreality. So there's a series of things that are going on within the context of where and how New York appears in the context of all of these kinds of interactions. We're faced with something a bit more like this right now. So empty rooms and people that are appearing in virtual spaces. That presents a set of challenges in terms of how we might construct something more like this. And so what we've been doing at Monash is attempting to kind of figure out what the framework is that would allow that to happen smoothly and transparently. The goal is to arrive at something more like this, and kind of the messiness of studio perhaps is not as possible as we might assume it to be. But the key here in this context is to limit the thinking relative to what is changing, and to make the assumption that really things are going to stay the same, except that this space or this place of studio will become a virtual place. So it's a change in place, not a change in pedagogy or curriculum, at least in terms of the way that we're triaging the conceptualization. So what that means in this case, or what I've narrowed it down to, is constructing analogies between key parts of the studio and the types of tools that we might use to reinforce those particular parts of the studio within the context of a virtual environment. So there are two main things that I've been working to reinforce within that context. One is the analogy between the desk, so where students are working in an immediate sense. And the second is with the pinup wall, so where groups gather to communicate with each other. And so can we use those two physical spaces and construct analogies that will allow us to engage those in a virtual way? What I've come up with and what we've been working with most immediately, and we're kind of continuing to develop further, is a system that uses three components designed to minimize bandwidth and to maximize interactivity, while also providing a more persistent place for students to interact. There are three components to this. The first is the Zoom video conference system, which we're using as a substitute for the desk grid. The second is, which is kind of in the center of the screen, if I can find my mouse up there, I can't, sorry, is the use of Google Docs as the place of studio. So it combines the desktop and the pinup space, so it's kind of a persistent thing. And the final thing is a form of an asynchronized, standardized formative self-assessment. And so those are the three components that we put together in order to kind of reconceptualize studio. Really briefly going to talk about what we're using Zoom for and how we're limiting it. Really, we're only using Zoom for face-to-face interaction. We're attempting to recognize it only as a communication tool and to ignore the potential spatial metaphors that it might involve. So in this case, that means using it for desk grids. There are a few reasons to do this. One is to limit the amount of time. Kind of staying on Zoom for several hours can be exhausting. If you have to remember to take breaks, and just if your voice goes hoarse, there's a whole series of things that happen, and there's cues that allow you to understand that, ooh, well, maybe I need to do something else for a moment, don't exist, or perhaps that a student is not reacting in the way that you might think that they are. So we want to limit the amount of time. The other thing that's kind of been in trouble with Zoom since we've gone online are bandwidth issues. So Zoom cutting out and not behaving in a way that's productive. So limiting that to desk grids. And so really that's kind of only a small portion of the time, quote unquote, in studio. The larger thing, or the bigger kind of component of reconceptualizing studio in this case, is how we're using Google Documents. And I'll walk you through this really briefly. Basically, it becomes, so each student, so if you notice on the left, there's an outline that begins with student discussion. So students can kind of place questions, they can kind of self-organize to conversations that they want to have while they're in studio together. And then there's a synopsis of what they're going to do. And then they have a space in the document in which they can upload their own work and in which others can comment on it and their tutor can comment on it. So I've kind of blanked out the student names. The tutor here is Danica Karajik. But so they can comment and talk about the work in a kind of in a formal way, but they can also use Google Docs chat to talk about the work in an informal way. So there's a kind of series of different ways that they can talk and communicate, but there's also a persistent way in which their work appears together as a studio and individually. The final thing that we're doing is we have a standardized means of assessment that helps to provide insight to the tutor and the student. It helps to avoid losing track of students. So this is something that students are undertaking on a weekly basis. It has a couple different zones. On the right, it has an area in which they are writing reflections on their studio work. They're also doing some formative self-assessment with the sliders in the lower right-hand corner based upon the learning outcomes for the studio. So they can do that, and there's a manner in which the tutors can come back and provide them feedback on how they're interpreting their own work. The central area is to present in a formal way their work in progress. And then finally, on the left-hand side, the students are requested to document the feedback that they're getting so that they're kind of more able to reflect on it and understand what they're being told and develop an action plan. So this kind of allows us to keep track of the students and make sure that nobody's disappearing or that they're kind of misunderstanding feedback that they're getting, or they're just not participating in the interactions, whether via Zoom or Google Docs. Finally, the next steps for us, we're continuing to experiment with other tools. The goal up to this point has been to be as simple as possible and to use familiar tools that everybody already knows how to use and that don't kind of put a load on our networks. So we're kind of beginning to experiment with other tools for face-to-face interactions, other tools to substitute for the desktop or the pinup space. And we're working from that to also begin to think about developing much more sophisticated analogs, so beginning to use VR and other types of immersive spaces to mimic the physical place and gestures of the studio.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks.
All right, very good. And now I think we're moving on to Mohammed. And again, we've got some more questions coming in. Stephen answered some questions from the first bit. So some of these questions are a bit presenter specific. So also invite our panelists to answer the questions following their presentation. And over to you, Mohammed.
Great. Can you see the screen? Can you hear me now? Great. Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm just going to go through today how we can reimagine what studio juries can look like. And what I'm going to use is the conference as some sort of transitionary model. So there are, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of conferences happening this year. And again, excuse me, but because my field is more into kind of computation, so most of the conferences that I'm aware of are kind of more computation oriented, but they're happening all over the world. And the idea was that obviously everyone goes to the conference and presents their work, but this is what happened. Many of the conferences have been postponed. Some conferences that are occurring in September, October, I think are holding on to the very thin thread of hope that they can still carry on those conferences. So they've just gone mute. They haven't really updated their websites. But there's one specific conference that has kind of provided a very interesting model, which is the CMODE conference, Simulation for Architecture and Urban Design. And what I'd like to go through today is their approach on how they're transitioning online and how we can perhaps use that in our own design studios for our own students. So this conference was supposed to take place in Austria in May, the end of May, but then they've kind of just sent out this really well-planned email to all the participants with kind of a step-by-step of how they're transitioning online and what measures they're going to take. And so what I'm going to try to do today is summarize these measures and draw comparisons between what a live jury or a pre-recorded jury, what differences they have. So with the traditional conference, for example, you have just, a normal conference day. Within the conference day, you probably have multiple sessions. Within each session, you have various presentations. So the sessions are simultaneous. The presentations within each session are sequential. And then at the end of every presentation, there's like a 5 minutes, Q&A or feedback from the people within that session. So there is always one downside of this, is that if you're a participant in this conference, you can only attend one session at a time. And so you can only see one presentation per session, or some presentations per session. So what CIMOD did was they were like, okay, so we still want to go ahead with the conference date. They don't want to delay it, which is really good news for people who have papers accepted, because at least their papers get published. So what they said is that they're gonna follow a different model. So rather than having all of this happening within a single day, they're going to divide it into 3 days. So day one would be participants pre-record their presentations. And they requested their participants to keep the presentations to 12 minutes. And once they pre-record these presentations, they upload them to either YouTube or Vimeo, and they provide the conference organizers with a video link. What the conference organizers are going to do with this video link is that they're going to then distribute all of the video links for the various presentations to all the registered participants. And that would happen on day 2, where then all the registered participants have access to all of these various presentations to review them, watch them, record any questions they have or any comments they have on the various presentations. And then day 3, they will hold then live sessions, each session happening simultaneously, similar with a conventional approach, but where here people can engage and interact with the authors of these various papers in a live platform to kind of ask questions, get feedback, and learn more about the different projects. So the first 2 days are kind of pre-recorded. So, you pre-record the lectures, but then there's still a live component, which I think is very important to kind of still maintain. So I just tried to list down advantages and disadvantages or limitations. And I think this is quite good to do. And I would love to hear more added to this list. I must admit that I have more for the advantages than the limitations. So maybe there are a few more limitations. So what are the advantages of adopting this model into a studio environment? By pre-recording the presentation, students are forced to prepare and practice their presentations. I think this is a new, maybe pedagogical approach to how students approach a presentation, where usually sometimes students are a little bit overconfident and they think they can wing it. And we've all probably seen a few students who try to do that. Giving those students an opportunity to record their presentations, and maybe they can watch it before uploading it. Maybe they want to re-record it. It allows them to be more self-critical of how they're presenting their own work. And I think that's a very good advantage for students to have the time to do. Another advantage is with the projected bandwidth limitations, and there's been a lot of articles in the news about projected bandwidth limitations in the coming future with everyone working at home and online. There is a very real chance that as students are presenting online, there is a network disconnection, which might interrupt the presentation. This is actually quite significant because not only are students not able to present their work in a very streamlined way, but also they're still getting used to this new online platform. They're not really used to this method, and that would just really increase their stress levels if they suddenly, cut their presentation in half. Another advantage is that students are able to pre-record, the jury members are able to watch the presentations more thoroughly, I think. Being able to better prepare their questions or their feedback that they want to give to the students. And also it gives the jury some time to watch these presentations at their own time. So it doesn't have to be during midday on a weekday where a specific jury member might be offline. Another advantage is that students would be able to watch each other's presentations. And I think that's quite good because, again, during live presentations or conventional presentations in studio, yes, there are students who are engaged or watching others' presentations, but there are those students who are just very stressed, waiting for their own presentation time. They can't really focus on other people's presentations. But in this way, if we provide a deadline for students to upload their presentations, then and give a day for everyone to watch each other's presentations, I think that's a really kind of good model for students to watch one another and learn from each other. Unlike the conference approach, where the live sessions, where the jury would come and give feedback to the students in a live setting, and the conference approach, or at least a CMOD approach for May, they're going to have these sessions run simultaneously. But for smaller studios where you only have 10 presentations, they can still be sequential so that everyone can be involved, everyone can be there to listen to the different feedback different presentations are receiving from jurors. Back there. Studios, so some limitations. So studios will need to factor in the time for pre-recording. This is going to no doubtedly affect the schedule for a studio. So where we're giving, let's say, a deadline for a presentation, or the presentation date is a Wednesday, for example, now the presentation date has to be a Monday, where students upload their presentation on Monday, reviewers watch them on a Tuesday, and then the live session happens on Wednesday. So there's this delay period that's going to take place. Another limitation would be that we're losing some of the essence of a presentation in an architectural environment. So presenting live is, I think, part and parcel to any architecture student's education. And there's that rush of adrenaline that a student should have when presenting live, and that's lost when pre-recording. Nonetheless, there is a counter argument that that rush of adrenaline is still there during the live feedback, especially if the feedback is more of a question and critique rather than just, general comments. Finally, the last one I have on the list is maybe not all jurors, but some jurors might fall in the trap of over-scrutinizing a student's work if they have elongated access to a presentation. So if they can rewatch the presentation several times, they can have kind of unwarranted scrutiny of a student's work that maybe is unnecessary. So that's basically kind of what I had to talk about today. I'll just add a little bit to Stephen and Jason's presentations, which is how we can use Zoom to sketch. This was completely unrelated to the topic, but Stephen kind of asked me to show this. With Zoom, you can annotate using your mouse. So I'm just going to demonstrate that now really quickly. So right now I'm annotating. I'll just draw a rectangle and a triangle. But I'm doing that with the mouse, and obviously it's not very easy to do with the mouse. It doesn't replace the pen. But what you can do is that if you have an iPad with a stylus, in Zoom, you can, when you click share screen down here, I'll annotate so that you can see, when you click share screen down here, you would get an option to use your iPad or iPhone to share the screen from your iPad or iPhone. And what that allows you to do is that it allows you to share your screen from an iPad and iPhone using AirPlay or using a cabled connection. And you can use that to sketch on your iPad and so display it to the students on the screen. So anyway, unrelated to the jury, but maybe some useful tip for those of you who are struggling a little bit with giving your students feedback. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Mohammed. All right, we're going to turn to our final presenter, Elizabeth, and noting that we are running a bit behind time. Just for all the attendees, I think we will just still try to entertain some Q&A time, so we'll probably let this session go over by maybe 20 minutes or something like that, just so that we can make sure that we do have a decent discussion. So if people can hang around until about maybe 20 past 12 Queensland time, 20 past 1 Eastern time, we'll see if we can make that work. So over to you, Beth. Thanks.
Beth, you're muted.
Hi, guys. I'm Beth Strauss. I'm going to go pretty quickly. We use something called Collaborate, and this is our announcement page. So you'll see the first thing we do every week is we create an announcement. And then if we go back, we create an announcement that'll say week 1, this week we expect you to do a site plan, blah, blah, blah. We're going to talk about it. But down here in the corner is the button for collaborate. And then we create a session, and then you join the session, and then we might also have, after you download a session, you can load your work, you can type your messages, and you can do many other things. So you can upload files. Now, you can upload a file, you can share a whiteboard, you can share an application.
Beth, are you changing your screen there? Because we're only seeing the one screen.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I wonder why that is. God, gosh, golly gosh. All right. End show. I'm coming back. New share.
That looks good.
Okay. So I'll just maybe do it this way, then I'm able to see. You can see loading.
Yep.
All right, so that's the announcement page. That's the tutorial page. And then these are the tools. You can type messages. You can join discussion groups. You can share your files. And you can show your face if you feel like it, although most of the time we don't show your face. You can use AutoCAD Live. Sometimes that works better than others, or another kind of program. Sometimes students like to do this because they're not really ready to show exactly what they want to present yet, and they're in stream, so they'll just go ahead and show you their screen. But dragging and dropping files is the main way you do that. And then you start a presentation discussion. There are whiteboard tools which you can use. And you can use breakout rooms, which sometimes it's useful to have smaller groups within a large group, so that if you want to talk one-on-one or to a small group. Right now we're doing a site plan group in second year, and I'm online for several hours. So we set a time for each of the smaller groups to come on. They're welcome to watch all of it, which a lot of them did, but they can also leave. And what we're finding too is that students need time, especially in undergrad, for socialization. So they really want their own time. Polling is, I've found it lately, is a really good way of little quiz questions, or asking, or even which solution do you prefer? It engages students, and they, seem to enjoy that. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is just a couple of things about things that other people haven't mentioned, and about the specifics. I mean, yes, you can always be drawing when you're talking. I could demonstrate that. We've already demonstrated that a bit. You must talk about online etiquette. You should raise your hand. You don't scroll through slides, because usually we make everybody a moderator so they can. You can chat your comment. I call this the Southern Baptist Church. Right on, man. Yeah, wow, or other comments. So sometimes it's very reinforcing, and you can listen to recordings. Now, the way I start my sessions is I always start with a short presentation, which I call it the inspiration. Often students are a little late getting on, and this way they know they should come on time, because that's when the good stuff is good. Another thing I've found is that it's really important that you give students equal time to talk, because the weaker students may use the stronger students to motivate, but they need to be able to present their work too. And then that leads to the next one, which is watch out for bullies. Bullies can talk about irrelevant topics, or refuse to take your advice, or ruin a session and make it boring. Move on. Borings can also complain in emails about other students or the way they've been treated online, and take care that these can sometimes be time consuming. The main thing I'd like to say is that online students like to watch, and I'm sorry about my spelling. They see images more clearly on their screen than on a projector, and they associate watching with screens and TV. So they really do like to watch. So this is an example of ePinup, which we use during the week. And you can see that we have, we often have another session for videos and the photos. And then there's a little button there. We can click whether we like it, and we can also make a lot of comments about it. So that's all I really kind of wanted to show you today, except to just demonstrate quickly two things. One, so for instance, just an example of something I might do in the beginning might be something like this. Well, all right, I might share a good student's work, which is always fun. Can you see this now? Okay,
yep.
So for instance, this is a student who did some good work. Students like to see lots of examples. And so then, you know, we might go through and show them some images of some good work. And then, but I might make a comment like, well, one thing they did was they took each other's, you know, solutions and sort of made a more integrated approach to it. And I might say, but, you know, I might say something like, I don't really like the way they've handled this area here. They could have done another entry over there, or, you know, their solar isn't oriented the right way there, and I'm making this up as I go. Something could be done with that site over there. So, you know, this is an example of you know, drawing as you're talking, but I always start with something that's a little bit shows them where they're headed and where to go. Or for instance, another thing might be to show something like like, you know, this, which is just really in your face, yummy. And we can talk about, you know, a sense of place or whatever. And this might be 15 minutes. And that would be all we would, how I might start a first or second year class. So that's all I'll say today. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Excellent. And that gets us a bit more on track with our time, so fantastic. So we've had a number of questions come through, so thank you to those who've been posting questions. I'm just going to see if there's, looks like we have one open question, which was for Elizabeth. Can you share an iPad screen on Collaborate?
No.
No, so it doesn't have that same function like Zoom.
You can log in on, having said that, yes, you can log in on an iPad, and you can use your pencil on iPad. So if you've got a good iPad, yes, you can do that, but you don't transfer over like you do on Zoom, you know, from a computer to an iPad.
Right.
And sometimes what people do is they'll load on 2 devices at once. So they'll have their, because it's easier to see on your computer, but you can draw better on an iPad.
Okay,
And we went through a period of time where we bought a bunch of Wacoms for everybody, but in the end, they weren't used very much. I think they weren't really, at least from my point of view, they weren't that much of a benefit. I find that in the old days, Collaborate had more line weights and it had a fill that was very useful. And so that was unfortunate that they got rid of it. But the big difference, I think, between Collaborate and Zoom is that Zoom screen share is instantaneous, and it doesn't matter how big your files are that you're showing on your screen, where in Collaborate, if you load really large files, then they slow down and sometimes they don't come through very well. But then it does make sure that students do load their work ahead of time, and that they know they're going to present. And as Stephen said, online students are better presenters than campus students. Campus students have to learn how to do that.
Okay, very good. Look, we've got a couple other questions coming through. So for any of the panelists, with online teaching, are you increasingly using more movie resources? And do you find that your way of presenting materials and content has changed?
I'll just say something about that.
Yep.
That, especially for first years, but there's a lot of YouTube videos about drawing techniques and stuff. And I'll load those up on ePinup. And, you know, because then I don't have to really get into some of the specifics as much on Collaborate. And also I've done lots of little videos about places I've gone, like Highline or Richard Serra sculpture, or the Chicago Biennial. When I went, I took a lot of little videos of things I saw there, and I use those. I put those up on ePinup, but they don't come up on, just like on, well, they don't come up very well on Collaborate, those sorts of videos. And Zoom, as you know, you can't show somebody else's recordings. You have to be careful about that. It has to be your own work.
Okay, very good. Hopefully that answers the bulk of that question. Another question that also just has jumped right out at me is that, what about the status of physical models, which is maybe a question on a lot of people's minds. How are physical models handled in your experience?
They're just as good as if they're in campus. Physical models work very well online. And this was a surprise when we started teaching a while back. They have to take more views, more photos of them, but you can draw over them, you can talk about them. The same requirements apply online.
Very good. And do you ever get students saying that they can't source model making materials, or that they have the kind of setup to be able to make models adequately?
These days, some people are complaining that they are having trouble sourcing materials. And, you know, so usually, like in second year, when they have to do proper house models that are very good, you can usually find some chipboard or some, you know, some decent materials around your house. And for first year, you know, sometimes we're encouraging them to use found materials, but generally they're still cardboard, if not balsa wood or other things.
Yep. Oh, very good. There was a next question that we had here about doing a demonstration of ePinup, so maybe we can save that one for another session perhaps. But
well, a few people have asked that. I can do it really quickly.
Yeah, sure.
If that, it sounds like a few people want to.
And while you're doing that, is that something that an institution needs to subscribe to, or is that like how does one access ePinup?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it is a proprietary thing. So we had a look around for closed social networks a few years ago, and this was the best one. So it was Social Buddy was the owner, but now that's moved to Hive Flare. So I put a note in one of the comments about that. So it's called Hive Flare now, but it pretty much just looks like a social network. Beth said we've got videos down the side, which are all curated. These ones I think are all posted by the tutors. There's a section that's got all the most recent photos. And so we should have blanked out student names here, but this is current. So this is what students in this have just been posting up recently. When you're talking about, can they still do physical models? Well, here you go. What is this? This is our first years.
It keeps scrolling because then they can see some of the comments. You know, and then,
oh dear.
For instance, all right, so for instance, Ava's the other tutor. Now she's put up some really good precedents that we are to look at because they have to frame views. So we're supposed to look at framing views. And then you can see that we, you know, we put a lot of, you know, comments on them. This is due on Sunday night. So everybody is madly trying to get some feedback. And we won't have a Sunday session like we normally do because it's too late. They just need to get it done.
So you can see that the students all go on and can like each other's work. We do ask them to be a bit more constructive in their comments rather than just clicking like. But the tutors there go through and respond and can post their own, as Beth said, inspirational images. And so that one is the thing that it is available as an app as well. And so we're hoping that will become more and more social as all our campus students are now doing this as well. That one was our online group. So I'm not sure if the campus ones are all quite that intense just yet.
All right, very good. I think we've got a few more minutes to answer a couple more questions. So another one that's come up is to just talk a bit about authorship. So showing sources, you know, quoting and citing references, or any other sort of problems that have to do with referencing or authorship. And I guess I would also have that question maybe in relation to group work as well.
Yeah, sure. So public links are fine to post up. So if things have come from, if we link them, that's fine. I was just having a look, some of those might have been posted as images, so they might have had, there might have been issues there, but if we just post links to the sites, then there shouldn't be issues with those.
Well, usually we give name, dates, and places, and you know where we got them or whatever. It's always good to paste that into the image, or at least the URL, so that everybody knows where you can go. And frankly, the things that are posted on ePinup we're more careful. You know, during a Collaborate meeting when we're just talking to students, then we treat it more like the blue carpet level or our presentation level at uni. You know, they're likely to see other students' work, and we would, you know, always say our resources and where they're coming from. But anything that's going to be up long term, although there are recordings, but they're only for the class, then yes, we're very careful.
All right, very good. And I guess there's another question around privacy and data protection, both for the institution and students. Are there structural things that you have in place?
For us, we've discovered when using Zoom that when you can limit Zoom so that only attendees with a specific email domain can join. We found that very useful, as at the beginning there were some instances of people sharing the meeting links, you know, tutors not being able to follow who all the participants are, not knowing who the participants are in the meeting are. So there's a function where you can activate only specific domains can join the meeting. The benefit of that, or the downside of that, is that if you had someone that you wanted to join the meeting but didn't have a university domain, then that person can't join. But they actually can. But what happens is that if someone tries to join a meeting with a different domain, they are automatically placed in a waiting room for the meeting host to approve and then to bring in. So that's quite good for ensuring kind of the privacy of a specific meeting within that group. I think there's another question about something that I've always wondered about: data protection for other students. And I think this is something maybe others can answer, but especially with recorded sessions, and when a session is recorded and then uploaded for other students to download, what happens if some of those students aren't really happy with their recordings being shared to others in the class?
Well, that's a real issue about tutors have to learn that they have to be positive, because they don't want to be seen as shaming a student because it's recorded and it's there. So if you're saying something that's more of a negative comment or something, try to frame it in terms of the whole class. Try to do this class, because we've had sometimes the online students that we get may have special conditions. They might be extra temperamental or emotional or something, and we have to be very, very careful that nothing can be misconstrued. For instance, somebody complained because I said read the brief, and the other tutor reinforced that and sort of bulldogged it a bit, went into it and emphasized, and then we got an email that she was complaining about the second tutor, so you have to be a bit careful.
Very good. Okay, we've got a couple more questions. I also, just because we still have about 46 attendees, which is great, and thank you everyone for spending the extra time. Just wanted to make sure that what was broadcast is that we're really keen through AASA to hear from you in terms of what kinds of resources you would like to see us provide. So to get the feedback, I think would be really great. If you want to see more webinars like this, if you have topics that you would like to suggest for future webinars, if there's other kinds of initiatives that you think that we can undertake, because the organization is really here to support the membership and to support the schools within our network. So, so if you want to provide those as, either email us or, even shove some of those suggestions into the question portal. If you have any, that would be great. Because we certainly want to take on that feedback to be able to do this again, and we'll all be a little bit more expert the next time we come back to have one of these sessions. I also wanted to just refer to the poll that just posed a couple questions about just getting started online. I don't know if can people see the live poll results, or am I the only person that can see that as the moderator?
I think, Chris, you can, there's a button where you can share or allow attendees to see the results.
Okay.
I don't know if that's only for meetings though. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to end the poll and then see if that, okay, here I can share the results. So now those have been shared. So hopefully you can see those, but you can see Zoom is really popular. I guess this is obviously going to depend a bit on where the people have come from that are in our sort of audience today. And also what kinds of issues people are having. So, students not having needed equipment would appear to be an issue, as maybe it's caught a few students off guard in terms of being able to prepare to shift offline. And I know we've had that in a few instances in our cohort as well. But thanks for participating in that poll. Okay, now all of a sudden it looks like we don't have any more open questions. Oh, here's a few more. Has any school begun to think about how public or not final studio reviews might be? That's a very good question. And has any school started to think about how end of semester student exhibitions might look? Also a good question.
We started thinking about, for the exhibition part, but very early days, and I think it's going to remain as a thought process, but some sort of immersive virtual environment sort of thing, where we have a virtual exhibition space where people can kind of like, when you have the 360-degree videos on YouTube, where you can kind of click and drag and immerse yourself in a space. That's one way I think that will be quite interesting. Also, if you provide an option for people who want to join the exhibition to kind of visualize the space with headsets, and you provide instructions on how to kind of make a makeshift headset, that would be a pretty cool way to do it, I think.
With Collaborate, you can use your phone, but it's always very tricky to get people to actually try it and do it. It's not actually that easy at first. You have to drop off a number or two to get it to work. And
to use the dial-in function.
yeah.
Yep.
All
right.
With that last question, can we have inter-school reviews? With the idea of pre-recording student presentations, I think it's also interesting that the presentations maybe are shared, so that they're not only shared within that tutorial group, but maybe they're also shared outside the tutorial group and maybe shared with other schools, so that other schools can now watch what's happening in specific studios in different universities. I think that would be a good approach to both share students' work and how they're presenting it, and maybe the live juries if they are recorded as well and shared. I think that's a good idea, actually.
Yeah, we tried to always get the online group to present to the campus group when we were still, when there was still a campus group. And that worked out really well. I mean, what we got on online are quite a lot of mature age students. So sometimes their work was a step up from what you might get in campus. Many of them were already draftsmen or something, or urban designers. And also there was a kind of issue about, show ponies. I mean, people like to show their work. And we sort of started, especially in second year, getting a two-tier class. I started getting a lot of students to ask me for private sessions because they were too ashamed of their work to show it in front of all the really good guys. So the good guys were good, but then it was intimidating because in some ways that wasn't really second year work. It was better than second year work. So it's always catering. I've tried to make that point, but to everyone, and to try to say it's okay. You're doing fine. Just give it a go. But yeah, I think that in other words, I think some students would object to having it too widely participate unless we had their permission, and that was maybe the certain group.
Yeah, one of the things that, just kind of following on a little bit with Mohammed's comments, we're also looking at potential VR solutions and kind of paying particular attention to the gaming industry. The broadcasting of esports is of interest, Twitch, Mixer. Like the gaming industry has solved a lot of issues that could, relative to kind of having lots of people online at the same time, interacting in kind of interesting ways. And so kind of I'm certainly researching and trying to kind of work with that industry to see what we can borrow from them and kind of adapt to make work within our context, because there's some great stuff that's available within that context. It also in terms of content management and kind of controlling interactions, things get a bit more extreme within that world. And so the ability to kind of get rid of trolls and to minimize harassment is quite critical within that industry, so that they also are working on some sort of issue we can kind of engage.
All right, very good. Look, I don't see any new questions coming up. I guess I'll just ask if the panelists have any final thoughts or comments, and then we might wrap it up.
I'd just like to reiterate that we've got potentially resources available to provide more of these or more targeted things, but we need to know what will best help architecture academics. So let us know what will help you, and we'll get to work on it.
Also, my advice is keep it simple, at first at least. They're students, they're just normal people. They want to talk, they want to hear you care about their work, and for you. Often what will happen with two tutors online at the same time, it's really helpful, sometimes because I can hear a student and I can be thinking of a resource that comes to mind, and I'll be kind of scrolling around on my internet for that, while somebody else is answering a question, and then, pop up that example, and So it works well when you have one, what I call hostess or host, and then one person who's really deeply critiquing it. And then, you can kind of go back and forth a bit.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I would kind of reiterate the keep it simple. I think that's a critical thing. And the other thing, at least in terms of the way that we're trying to think about it here, is to not think about innovating within the space, but to think about transposing and translating what we already know.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, well, if there's nothing further, I just want to thank our panelists, and thanks for taking the time to put those presentations together. They were all very coherent and I think very productive. And again, thanks to our attendees. I think this was a great first effort for us to get 56 or so attendees in the first go. So thanks very much, everyone, for spending the time, and thank you for contributing your questions. And again, we would love to get your feedback and suggestions about further ways that we can support this and really support each other. It's a really unique time where we're all being thrown into this simultaneously, and it's a great opportunity for us to collaborate. So thanks very much.
Well, I'll just say, can I say one more tiny thing? I mean, one idea that we'd had was wine and cheese night on Friday night, which is, maybe within our OUA, but it could be extended to be, more widely attended if the bandwidth lets us, but I don't see any reason why it shouldn't. And then that's fun because it's just discussing whatever. I think that what students really want too is a social life,
Especially now. Chris, there's one last question maybe. What's the image behind you?
Yeah, I was actually just typing an answer, but bonus points to anybody that knows. That's what I would do to my students. No, it's just, it's one of Michael Sorkin's site plans. So it's just a little nod to Sorkin. Good. Yeah, got a couple people that chimed in with the answer there. Yeah. So, an unfortunate casualty of this whole debacle. So.
Right.
Okay. Very good. Not to end on a sort of a somber note or anything, but do love his work. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. And we will distribute the link for this once it's up online and available, the recording. And I think also there was some requests to share the slides. And so what we might do is also just put the slides up on the AASA website as well as a downloadable resource if the panelists are open to doing that. So we'll sort that. Following on from this, and thanks again. I'm going to hit end meeting, and we will see you all next time. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks,
See you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.